Fusion therapy was controversial even among the psychedelic psychotherapists in the 1960s. Two psychoanalysts, Joyce Martin and Pauline McCurrick, developed a method of LSD psychotherapy that involved close physical contact between client and therapist during the session. It was felt to be particularly helpful for people with a history of early emotional neglect, and the treatment sought to instill, at a deep level, a reparative and embedded experience of a good mother. During the LSD session, the client would lie on a couch, covered in a blanket while being held in a close embrace, much as a mother might hold a child. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, the pioneer of LSD psychotherapy in the 50s and 60s, underwent a session of fusion therapy with Pauline McCurrick. He describes a profound regression to the stage where he became a nursing infant on the breast of a good mother, then a fetus in a good womb. He felt nourished by both the milk and the blood of his mother, and this held a strong sense of the sacred for him. The session culminated with an expansion into a transpersonal domain with a sacred union with the Great Mother Goddess. He described the session as profoundly healing, one of the most powerful experiences that he ever had. So psychedelics bring the gift of numinous experience. There's simply no other method that provides such open access to archetypal consciousness. The numinous has a sense of the sacred. It's the principle that underlies all religion. Its essence is mediated by an amplification of meaning so that the power and resonance of meaning challenges our ego structures and our prevailing way of being in the world. The numinous is awe-inspiring and mutative. There's enormous potential for growth. But the more powerful the instrument, the greater the risk of damage if the experience is insufficiently supported or integrated. The crucial point about the numinous is its bivalence with both dark and light manifestations. So incomplete or partial forms of the numinous can have a nightmarish primitive quality with an abrupt and capricious character, perhaps a little like a horror film. With this crude stage, with its ominous tone, has the potential to be transcended as the Numen reveals herself and the process unfolds. So our encounters with the divine feminine in high archetypal penetrant states may not always have that highly positive emotional quality that Grof described in fusion therapy. The emotional tone may be ominous or dread-filled, but these experiences can be worked with, supported and transmuted. Indeed, the learning from such difficult experiences can be of immense value. Ramakrishnan was a Bengali saint and devotee of Kali. One afternoon he watched as a beautiful woman ascended from the Ganges and approached the grove where he was meditating. He could see that she was about to give birth. In a moment the baby was born and she gently nursed it. Then suddenly her appearance changed so that she became monstrous and horrible. She took the infant in her jaws and crushed it. Swallowing the corpse, she returned to the Ganges and disappeared. How can eating babies bring forth growth? The literal mind struggles to plumb the depths required, but if a baby is seen as metaphorical, if it represents our ego structures, our desires, our narcissism, and our attachments to superficial structures, then maybe the answer starts to take some shape. The dark aspect of a feminine is challenging. Perhaps it's easier to maintain the deodorized image of the archetypal feminine offered by our cultural conditioning, the virgin birth, the saintly smiling Madonna. But we are poorer if we cannot hold a more nuanced version of the feminine. By averting our gaze from the shadow of the feminine, we also disown our own shadow, both on an individual and a collective level. So when we first encounter the archetypal feminine, she may appear in primitive forms. If the archetypal feminine has been alienated and rejected, the first meeting with her is likely to be difficult, gnarled, jagged, and dreadful. She approaches from the shadow, which can be frightening, even paralyzing. She's Medusa rather than Athena, and the assistance she offers may be subtle and mysterious. But the prize, if we persist, is that we process our shadow, accommodate our demons, expand our consciousness and move to a closer relationship with the archetypal self, spelt with a capital S. This is above all the journey of ego death and rebirth. The goddess Kali is associated with death and destruction. Although she can be worshipped as a benevolent mother goddess, she's better known for her dreadful aspect. She epitomises the dark goddess and is usually depicted as black. But Kali is also the penetrator of Maya, the world of illusion, ego structures. So Kali represents a mutative process. She will bring you to your demons, but she can also be the demon slayer. She feeds on demons and is usually depicted with a garland of severed demon heads. But she's also the goddess of salvation, a symbol of triumph over death. She's the principle of consciousness, of infinite darkness. She holds the threat of madness as ego dissolves, but with her grace, ego can be reborn in a transformed relationship with the primary energy of archetypal self, or spirit. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung pioneered the development of archetypal psychology until his death in the 1960s. He was a masculine man growing up in a patriarchal world, and his journey inevitably involved an integration of the feminine, which he termed the anima. So the anima is a transpersonal concept. She's that part of the psyche that has a feminine flavour, but she is also something completely other, acting as a mediator between ego and that which lies beyond our ego structures. We need help from anima to engage usefully with our shadow. Indeed, dealing with anima involves facing our darkness and engaging in the complex web of Maya before we can begin to disentangle from it and differentiate. So engagement with the anima, with the archetypal feminine, is a process of supreme importance for all of our psycho-spiritual development. So Jung went through a transformational crisis lasting about 4 years, a spiritual emergency that has parallels to the psychedelic experience. And he developed various techniques to engage with and integrate the material that was flooding out of his unconscious. His first active imagination journey took him to another world, a place that felt like the land of the dead, where he met two figures, an old man and a beautiful young woman. The old man was Elijah, and the young woman was Salome, the blind girl of whom he felt distinctly suspicious. Salome is the symbol of the femme fatale, the voluptuous dancing girl who seduces old men and demanded the head of John the Baptist. No wonder Jung was wary. And yet Jung was intrigued. Who did Salome represent, and why had she appeared to him at this point? And in pondering these questions, the encounter with Salome paved the way for Jung's progressive integration of the feminine and was a crucial step in his own healing and growth. So Jung also describes how the anima principle can be seductive in a way that promotes, or can promote, a disengagement with reality. Like the sirens of the Odyssey or the whispering Lorelei of the Rhine, they can steer us onto the rocks. But the anima also provides a window into our deep unconscious if we can but ground it, and our intellect, our rational mind, is needed for this integrative task. Hence Jung's dyad of the old man representing the saturnine principles of logos and sight in the external world, as opposed to Salome's entirely different form of perception. An excess of the Elijah archetype leads to rigidity, but he's necessary perhaps to add some form and shape to the more fluid but archetypally nourishing feminine. So maybe holding that dynamic tension between Elijah and Salome is a useful model for managing any psychedelic or high archetypal penetrant state. Holotropic breathwork was developed by Stan and Christina Groth as a non-drug method of accessing a psychedelic state after the use of LSD was made illegal in the 1960s. This is an extract from a holotropic breathwork session. As my session progressed, I was having a frustrating time. I was stuck in my thoughts, and I felt like a very limited human being who just could not leave behind the chattering mind. Groff had been teaching us about dark night of the soul states. At such times we feel a profound bleakness of spirit with a mood of futility and hopelessness, and this was where I seemed to be heading. In holotropic breathwork, we're encouraged to make it bigger, to amplify what we're feeling, and to surrender to whatever comes up. So I consciously surrendered to my inner process, let go of my resistance, and allowed myself to follow where I was being led. I seemed to go through a threshold, and I found myself in another landscape. A massive female figure reclines at ease beneath the crust of the earth. She seems a few miles long, judging by the tiny figures of the humans above her. She's propped on one elbow as she surveys the scene above her, the devastation, the mud, the craters, the blood, the ghastly landscape of the trenches of the First World War. She seems calm and at ease, while above her, and oblivious to her presence, men live out their little lives. I see them die like ants. I am in awe. She seems more real to me than everyday reality. I'm frightened, although I know that I'm being shown something important. It's as though I'm frozen, hoping she won't notice me, being as still and unobtrusive as I can be. I'm holding two conflicting emotions, the desperate sorrow for the grief that we cause each other with our stupid conflicts, but also gratitude and reverence of this supernatural being who's holding us watchfully, even with tenderness, while we go through our collective developmental agonies. An experience of this nature requires careful integration. The integration process has layer upon layer. There is low-hanging fruit that's easy to pick, but some of the fruit lies in high branches and you have to reach for it. It takes time and patience. And it's probably inevitable that some of the integration process is challenging to our existing way of seeing the world and ourselves. But we need to accept this challenge to harvest the fruit of our labour. To state it briefly, my first insight was, of course, to reaffirm that history has a developmental trajectory, that humanity is still at an immature stage of development. The Dark Lady, for that's how she seemed to me, was like a mother watching toddlers. It seemed to me that the metaphorical trenches in which we find ourselves, the breathtaking suffering, man's inhumanity to man, these are but necessary developmental steps in the evolution of our collective psyche. How else do we learn about the futility of war and collective trauma if we do not experience it fully, deeply, and viscerally? This is how we grow from our tribal ethnocentricity to become true citizens of a global humanity, perhaps even a cosmic collective psyche. Maybe I knew this before, but I felt as though this understanding was seared into me now. The Divine Goddess was certainly giving us some tough love, but at least she was with us. Her lap was just underneath, although we do not see it. This type of insight can lead to the perspective that everything that happens in the world, however bad it seems, is actually pitch perfect, that there's a bigger teleological picture that's orientated towards our growth. But the trap here is that while focusing on the bigger picture, it can become possible to lose focus on the smaller, more human picture. And it became clearer to me that if there is a bigger picture, it's all the more important to bring care, compassion and love to all that we see in the trenches of everyday life. As Ram Dass suggests, life could be a statement of love and compassion, and where it isn't, that's where the work lies. I haven't finished yet. Hannah knew she had something deep inside her that hadn't been accessed in her psychotherapy training. In an attempt to go deeper, she went on an ayahuasca retreat. The low-dose session was fine, but in the second session she became frightened and paranoid. She thought she was in a dangerous place, and the people there might do her harm. The facilitator's faces seemed twisted and malign. She decided to leave while still under the influence, and the facilitator simply watched her depart. She had a terrifying journey home using public transport, and the next day everything seemed so much worse. She felt paralysed, with anxiety that now had a paranoid tinge. She had a crushing sensation in her chest, and she felt utterly alone and helpless. Grof suggests that people who have an unintegrated psychedelic experience of this nature need to return to the same depth of psyche in order to work through and process that experience. Holotropic breathwork retreats often have people who would fall into this category. It's the only legal avenue that they have available. Indeed, I met and worked with Hannah during such a retreat. It has taken a great deal of courage to come. She was new to holotropic breathwork and understandably suspicious. Her breathwork session was very powerful. She was physically very active on the mat, and there were times when she seemed in great distress. She had a crushing feeling in her body that needed to express herself, and we worked with her intensely using focused release techniques. One of the advantages of holotropic breathwork is that trauma is often processed and released in a very physical manner. The body does indeed keep score. After a couple of hours, she settled and indicated that she wanted to be held. One of the female facilitators lay on the mat with her for the last hour, holding her again as a mother might hold a child. This version of fusion therapy occurs from time to time in holotropic breathwork. After the session, she told us that she had felt that an Inca sorceress was crushing her chest in a torture device. She was malign and wanted her heart. After a while, the faces of this being started to change into the faces of people who had hurt her in the past, even the twisted faces of the facilitators in the ayahuasca session. Part of her wanted to run out of the room, but we had discussed this scenario with her beforehand, and with our encouragement, she was able to stay with it. She felt energy moving through her body. There were places where it felt blocked, but the bodywork seemed to help its expression, and eventually she transitioned into another place that had an entirely different tone. She felt a state of great peace and love. She was in the arms of her mother at last, then all the mothers in the world, and then a more abstract sense of union and belonging with all that there is. The feelings of existential despair, futility, and hopelessness of a so-called bad trip is one of the most challenging experiences that we can encounter in a psychedelic session or spiritual emergency. But in accessing this profoundly dark material, we allow the possibility of trauma resolution, of healing. It's not immediately obvious that this has anything to do with the feminine, but Stanislav Grof has linked these dark night of soul experiences to an aspect of the birth process that occurs when the paradise of the supportive womb is lost, the uterus starts to contract, we are rhythmically crushed, and we are threatened with extinction. This entire process is driven by the feminine in different aspects and holds profoundly archetypal qualities. The womb is the source of biological support, but also a place of cosmic union. Sometimes the womb can become toxic, especially just before birth is triggered. And then the onset of labour with its pulverising force is a primal threat to the organism, the ultimate existential challenge. At this stage, the cervix is closed, so there's no escape, no hope. We are ranged against insuperable forces. We are being crushed by the feminine. Then as the cervix opens, it becomes possible to make progress, and the life and death struggle begins through the birth canal towards the external world. As the baby emerges, its previous life comes to a decisive end, but there is life after this death. So the mother, the feminine principle, first conceives us, then nourishes us in the uterus, before we are expelled from paradise and subjected to hideous torment. Re-experiencing this cycle and surrendering to it in an expanded sense of consciousness enables some resolution of deeply held traumatic residue, which can echo very loudly in the way that we lead our lives. Grof found that many of his LSD psychotherapy patients were hindered in some very important ways in their adult lives because of unresolved emotional trauma, which seemed to relate to this perinatal process. And we certainly find the same holds true in holotropic breathwork retreats. Without working through this process in expanded consciousness. This material is very difficult to access. It's not necessary to go through a birth process in a session, although a few people do. Usually it's more of an archetypal symbolic journey. On a collective level, as we fight to save our beautiful planet, perhaps we can see a vengeful quality in our destructiveness. Perhaps the archetypal climate that prevails contains an acting out on a global level of our fury against the rejecting feminine, epitomised by the rigid patriarchal figures who float on the archetypal waves of our times. But perhaps this is part of a collective shadow which is becoming available for us to process if we can only integrate it. This is one of the gifts of serious work in expanded states of consciousness, that deep, sometimes subtle wounds can be healed in our personal and collective psyche. In resolving the trauma of our encounter with the destructive aspect of the feminine, we can become more fully born, more completely alive, more whole, and ultimately more conscious of who we really are. Thank you.